My name is Gordon Hensley. I'm 42 years old and I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. What I'm about to tell you happened almost 15 years ago, but to this day, when I close my eyes, I can see every detail of that night, as if I were reliving it. My wife thinks it was just our imagination, that we were tired, scared, and our minds filled the gaps with something worse than what really happened. But I know what I saw. I know what we felt. It was October 2009 and we were coming back from a family trip through Georgia. Me, my wife Melissa, and our children Dylan and Emily, who were 9 and 6 at the time. We had left too late and ended up taking a wrong turn on the road. The gas tank was already on empty, and every mile we passed made me more nervous. I knew at some point the car would stop, and it did, right in the middle of nowhere. No cars passing by, no lights anywhere, so just the sound of crickets and the wind rustling through the trees. I got out of the car to try to get a signal on my cell phone, but it was useless. It was then that Emily pointed out a light in the distance, behind some trees. A huge house, Victorian, with lit windows. In the middle of that darkness, it looked like an invitation, a relief. Melissa hesitated, but I argued that we had no choice. So we took the kids and walked down the dirt road to the house. The door was heavy, made of dark wood with an old-fashioned knocker. I knocked twice and waited. A few seconds later, we heard the latch turn and the door slowly creaked open. On the other side, an elderly woman stood, frail, with her white hair tightly pinned up. Her face was pale and wrinkled, but her eyes were strangely lively. She looked at us for a moment and smiled. "Are you lost?" Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. I explained the situation, and before I even finished, she was already opening the door wider and inviting us in. "You can't stay out there tonight," she said. "Come in, come in." The house smelled of old wood and something sweet but nauseating. The hallway led to a living room full of heavy furniture and red curtains. A grandfather clock ticked, and it was almost midnight. Melissa gave me a look as if to say, "This is a bad idea," but we were already there. The lady showed us to the rooms, one for me and Melissa and another for the kids. She didn't ask much, not even our names. She just said we should rest because the road was dangerous at night. I tried to sleep, but something was off. The house was silent, but every now and then I swear I could hear a sound coming from the hallway, like a whisper, distant and low. I turned to Melissa, who was lying with her back to me, and decided to ignore it. But then I heard the creak of a door. I got up slowly, trying not to wake her, and went to the hallway. Everything seemed the same, but when I looked to the end of the hall, I saw the door to the kids' room slightly open. My hairs stood on end. I walked over and peeked through the crack. Emily and Dylan were asleep, but there was something strange in the mirror in the room. It wasn't our reflection. The figures in the mirror were us, but not exactly. Dylan was sitting on the bed, but his reflection was standing, staring at me. Emily was lying on her side, but in the mirror, her eyes were wide open, and they were, smiling. Not a normal smile. It was too wide, exaggerated, like the skin was stretched. My breath caught in my throat, and then without warning, the door slammed shut in my face. I jumped back and tried to turn the doorknob. Locked. I banged on the door, calling for my kids, but nothing. Melissa appeared behind me, scared, asking what was going on. Before I could respond, we heard a noise coming from downstairs. Footsteps. I looked at the stairs, expecting to see the lady coming up, but there was no one. The footsteps continued, like something was walking around downstairs. Melissa grabbed my hand, and at that moment, the kids' room door opened by itself. I rushed in. Emily and Dylan were still asleep, but the mirror was empty. There were no reflections, no furniture, no bed, not even us. Just a dark surface, like smoky glass. I grabbed the kids and ran out of the room. Melissa followed close behind. We rushed down the stairs, but when we reached the living room, the lady was there. She was sitting in an armchair in the corner, watching us. "Where are you going?" she asked, too calm. I said we needed to leave. She sighed as if she already knew this was going to happen, and got up. "All right," she said, walking toward the door. She unlocked it and opened it, pointing outside. The night seemed darker than before. We left without looking back. We walked back to the car, my heart still pounding. But when we got to the road, my blood ran cold. The car was on, the dashboard lights were on, and the fuel gauge showed half a tank. like it had never been empty. We didn't think twice. We got in and sped away as fast as we could. When I looked in the rearview mirror, the house was still there with its lit windows, but I swear I saw silhouettes standing on the porch. Not just the lady, but several other figures. We never spoke about it again, never told anyone. But sometimes when I'm driving at night and I see a lonely house with lights on in the distance, I remember that night, that mirror, and how for a moment my reflection smiled at me, alone. My name is Garrison. I'm 32 years old, and I live in Houston, Texas. The story I'm about to tell happened about 5 years ago, but to this day I still can't understand what really happened. I was traumatized, and I still get chills when I think about it. It was a hot summer afternoon, and Matt, my brother, and I decided to take a drive. We were aimlessly driving down the road. We ended up on a more remote path without realizing that the gas was running out. The car stalled in the middle of nowhere in Texas, but we didn't plan for that, of course. We tried starting the engine several times, but it was too late. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere with the heat pressing down on us. It was a strange place, just dirt and more dirt around us. No cell service, no houses, no cars passing by. It was like time had stopped there. We decided to try to find somewhere to ask for help, since the sun was starting to set. We walked and walked until we saw a farm in the distance. There was a large old house and a barn in the back. Hope surged immediately. "Let's go there," Matt said, almost exhausted, his voice tired. By this point, we were both drained and starting to feel a little panicked. We reached the farm and were greeted by two twin girls. They were on the porch staring at us with blank, vacant expressions, like they had been waiting for us. I didn't think much of it at first, but something about those kids didn't feel right. They were really young, no more than 8 or 9, and they looked old. You know when you look at a kid and you feel like something about them doesn't match their age? That was the feeling. They had something odd about them, but I couldn't place it. "Our parents are in the barn. They can help you with the gas," one of the girls said in such a calm voice, it almost seemed rehearsed. I looked at Matt and he just nodded. After all, what else could we do? We went to the barn, but we didn't find anyone there. The smell of hay and old wood was strong, but there were no signs of life. No sounds, no movement, just silence. "Are they somewhere else?" Matt asked, a little suspicious. We went back to the house, and the girls were still there, like they were waiting, but something had changed. Their gaze was more intense, as if they were studying every little movement we made. Night started to fall, and the atmosphere grew heavier. The girls told us that their parents had gone out, but they would be back soon. That's when I started noticing a small detail that seemed insignificant at first, but sent chills down my spine later. The girls weren't blinking. Not once. Their eyes were fixed on us the entire time, never taking a break. It wasn't until later that I realized every time we looked again, they were a little closer. It was like they were moving without moving, getting closer each time, eyes locked on us, never blinking. I tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion, that I was imagining things. But it wasn't just that. As night fell completely, I started hearing strange noises from inside the house, as if something was moving around. But the girls didn't move. They stayed there, on the porch, watching. Suddenly, when I glanced to the side, I saw something even more disturbing. There were more girls, with the same vacant eyes. They were standing in the shadows, and once again, not blinking. I couldn't think straight anymore. The sensation that something was terribly wrong started to consume me. "Matt, we need to get out of here," I said, trying to keep calm. But he seemed even stranger, staring at the girls with those empty eyes, almost like he was hypnotized. Every time we looked, more of them appeared. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I began to sweat coldly. More and more girls, with the same eyes, the same empty expression, were moving closer, and there was nothing we could do. We started walking back to the car, but it seemed like the girls were everywhere. Every time we looked in another direction, there were more of them. It was like the number never stopped growing. I couldn't tell what was real and what was just my paranoid mind. Those girls, with their vacant eyes and constant gaze, were everywhere. When we finally got to the car, I looked back, and for a second I thought it was over. But it wasn't. I could still see the girls at the top of the hill, watching, as if they were waiting. They were still there, and they never blinked. After everything, we finally made it to the nearest town. The fear was still with me, and when I looked at Matt, I saw the same fear in his eyes. We didn't say much on the way back, just drove in silence, with the feeling that something had been left behind, something we never really understood. I tried searching for an explanation online, but I couldn't find anything that made sense. I tried to tell myself it was just a hallucination, that we were exhausted and tired. But the girls, their eyes, I know what I saw was real. That will never leave my mind. I don't know who those girls were or what happened there, but to this day, whenever I drive through Texas, my heart races when I pass places like that. I know somehow those girls are still there and... My name is Sullivan. I'm 33 years old, and I'm from Charlottesville, Virginia. This happened about 6 years ago, but to this day, whenever I think about that night, the fear still tightens my chest. I have to share this with you because if I tell anyone else, they won't believe me. Deep down, I still wonder what happened and why those photos were there. It all started with a simple trip with 2 friends. We had rented a car and planned to take a leisurely drive through the mountains of Virginia, just enjoying the road and the scenery. But like any road trip story, luck wasn't on our side. The car ran out of gas in the middle of a deserted road where we couldn't see another soul for miles. Just trees and more trees. I won't lie, I got nervous. We tried everything, but the cell phone didn't have signal, and our only option was to keep moving on foot. The night was already falling, and we started to feel a little desperate. When you're in the middle of nowhere, on a dark road, far from everything, you start realizing that you might be in a more dangerous situation than you thought. That's when we saw a distant light, deep in the woods. It was faint, but enough to catch our attention. We walked towards it, and soon enough, we found an old cabin. It looked isolated, but the light was still on, and something inside of us told us it was better to try and ask for help. We were all tired, and the idea of a warm, safe place seemed so good at that moment. When we knocked on the door, an old man opened it. He looked like a pastor, hunched over a little, with white hair and beard, but he had a friendly smile. Without hesitation, he invited us in, saying it wasn't safe to be on the road at night. We didn't think twice. The cold was starting to bite, and the night was getting thicker by the minute. We were relieved, but something told me that this relief came at a price. The old man offered us tea, gave us a room each, and it was some kind of relief. The place was dusty, looked very old, but had a strange feeling, like time didn't pass there. However, the weirdest thing of all was that one of the rooms in the cabin was always locked. When we asked about it, the old man gave some excuse about needing to keep that space closed, but assured us it wasn't anything important. He had a strange look when he spoke about it, a look that seemed to hide something, but our exhaustion quickly made us forget any suspicion. I, like any curious person, couldn't let that slide. In the middle of the night, when everyone was asleep, I got up and went to the locked room. My mind was full of questions, and the need to know what was inside consumed me. The key was on the table, and before I could change my mind, I grabbed it and opened the door. The room was completely dark, but the light from the lantern I carried illuminated something that made me freeze. It was a wall full of photos. Our photos taken from angles that couldn't possibly have been natural. Some showed us on the road, at moments when we never would have imagined someone was watching us. In others, we were inside the car, and the scariest part, the photos were taken while we were moving, without realizing it. It was like someone had been following us since the beginning of the trip, capturing our every move, as if they knew where we were at every moment. The feeling of dread was instant. I froze, looking at those images, trying to understand what was going on. How could someone have followed us the entire time? And why did the old man have these photos? I didn't know whether to scream, run, or face the situation. All I knew was that it didn't make sense. I quickly went back to my room, locking the door behind me. I was pale and speechless, but I couldn't sleep. I kept turning in bed all night, hearing strange noises coming from outside, and feeling like someone was always there, watching. I tried to convince myself I was becoming paranoid, but I couldn't. The next morning, the old man was calm, as if nothing had happened. He offered us breakfast, and in a calm voice, told us we should leave soon before the fog got worse. We left, not looking back, and since that day we haven't been able to find the cabin again, even after going back multiple times. I tried searching online, but there was no record of a cabin in that area. Nothing. It was as if it had never existed. I tried to tell my friends, but they thought I was exaggerating. They said maybe the fatigue had affected me, but in my heart I knew what I had seen. Those moments were etched in my mind, and the photos, well, they were haunting me. The fear I felt that night still follows me. When I close my eyes, I still see those images, and the feeling that someone was watching us has never left me. What scares me the most to this day is that after that night, I started noticing little things that seemed strange, as if the old man was still watching us. I even tried searching for information on the internet, but I never found anything about that cabin. No references, no stories from other travelers. Nothing. It was as if the place had never existed. The fear I felt that night still haunts me, and the image of those photos still terrifies me, wondering how it all happened. To this day, I don't know what really happened in that cabin. I don't know if it was a trap, a nightmare, or something even stranger. All I know is that I'll never forget that feeling of being watched, and maybe, just maybe, the old man let us go for some reason. But I don't know why, and that's what scares me the most. My name is Quentin. I'm 32 years old, and I live in Birmingham, Alabama. This happened about 2 years ago, but to this day, whenever I close my eyes, I see that man standing in the window. I can't stop thinking about it, so I decided to share my story with you all. Maybe if someone else has gone through something similar, I'll finally understand what happened that day. It was a hot summer afternoon, and my wife, Sarah, and I were driving back home after a road trip around Alabama. The plan was simple. Drive through the small towns, explore the quiet places, away from our daily routine. But fate had other plans for us. We were on a very isolated road, far from any gas stations, when our car started sputtering. Suddenly, the engine died. Sarah and I exchanged a look, and I tried to restart it, but nothing happened. The tank was empty. I felt like an idiot. I should have checked, I thought. How did we end up here, with no gas stations nearby? The sun was already setting, and the road ahead seemed endless. We decided to get out of the car to try and find a solution. There were no lights, no other cars passing by. The only thing visible was an old house in the middle of a field to our left. It looked deserted, with dusty windows and faded paint on the facade. Still, it seemed like the only place nearby where we could ask for help. We walked over to the house, and honestly, I was expecting to find at least a phone or some way to get gas. The door was slightly ajar, which made me hesitate for a moment. Sarah, however, was already ahead, pushing the door open with a determined motion. I followed her, feeling a tension I couldn't explain. Inside, everything was frozen in time. It felt like a time capsule from the 60s, old furniture, a turned-off tube television, and even a black and white photo of a couple on the wall. It didn't look like anyone lived there, but it didn't look abandoned either. It was like everything was on pause, waiting for something. "This is so weird," Sarah whispered, looking around. I didn't know what to think. Everything was so still. Dust had accumulated on the furniture, but the smell, it was fresh. It didn't make sense. We decided to explore a bit more. I walked through the living room, trying to check if there was anything useful, while Sarah went to the kitchen. When I turned to call her, I noticed something. There was a figure in the window. A man. He was standing outside, staring directly at the house. He wasn't moving, but he was, watching. "Sarah," I murmured, feeling a chill run up my spine. "Look at this." She came over and looked out the window too. The man was distant but clearly visible, standing in the field. "He must be a local," Sarah said, trying to convince herself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I looked again, trying to spot more details, but the figure was still there, motionless. Then, in the blink of an eye, he was much closer. Way closer. In fact, he was almost at the window. I hadn't even seen him move, but somehow he was right there, just a few feet away from us. Panic began to set in. What's happening?" I asked, my voice cracking. Sarah stepped back, her eyes wide, her mouth dry. She looked at me and in a whisper said, Quentin, he's closer." The man wasn't in a hurry, but he was getting closer. It wasn't normal. I had never seen someone move so fast without even realizing it. I looked out the window again, and now he was just a few steps away from the door. But how? How had he gotten so close without us hearing anything? My mind was spinning. I was starting to believe that this man wasn't real. Something didn't add up. Sarah grabbed my hand, and I pulled her inside the house, slamming the door behind us. The silence was deafening. I tried to breathe, but the air felt thick, hard to swallow. We tried using the house's phone, but there was no line. Our cell phones had no signal, and the more I tried to understand what was happening, the stronger the feeling that we were being watched became. We were trapped in a house that seemed to exist outside of time. We stayed there, sitting on the living room floor, trying to stay calm, but nothing felt right. The sound of the wood creaking upstairs, as if someone was walking up there, made me jump. But no one was there. No doors were open, no visible movement. The house was still again, as if it had swallowed everything in silence. The tension dragged on like fog, and my fear kept growing. When I looked out the window again, the man was no longer there. The field was empty. The relief was instant, but it was also confusing. How had he disappeared so quickly? How could such a clear, close figure vanish like that? We decided to leave that house. I needed to get out of there, feel the fresh air, and see the world again. When we stepped out the front door, what scared me most wasn't seeing the empty field, but the fact that the car was still there, just like we had left it. The engine was off, but the tank was full. We couldn't understand it. Everything felt so wrong, so out of place. I knew that when we looked back, the house would have disappeared. And that's exactly what happened. It didn't take long, and when I looked at the spot where it should have been, the field was empty. There was no trace of a house or any sign that it had ever been there. To this day, I don't know what happened that afternoon. But every time I drive down that road in Alabama, I glance at the fields, hoping to see something or someone that will help me understand. But I never see anything. Nothing but emptiness.